He was a broken man who'd buried love with his past. She was a girl with no name, no shoes, and a secret that could destroy them both. When she knocked on his door that freezing night, neither knew their world was about to change forever. What happens next will leave you breathless, because not every rescue begins with a hero, and not every ending is what you expect. The wind roared across the vast Montana prairie, whipping snow like scattered pearls from a cracked bowl. Every gust seemed to carry echoes of regrets long buried. From the porch of his lone cabin, Elijah Moore watched the world through squinted eyes, his breath drifting in the cold air, appearing and vanishing like a spirit. At 38, he carried the weight of a life-unneeded rest on his shoulders. The loss of his wife and son in the relentless grip of post-war hardship had hollowed him out. He had built walls instead of fences, isolating himself from the world beyond his cattle and winter chores. He had meant to leave the notice tacked to the general store's bulletin board as a practical necessity farmhand needed room and board provided. Nothing more. What he truly sought was a break from solitude. Yet he doubted anyone would come. Stories of brutal winters and empty homesteads spread faster than any invitation, and most had chosen the booming towns of California goldfields or eastern homesteads brimming with hope. Not many still believed a man could wrest hope from the frozen earth of Montana territory. After tying his horse in the barn, he returned inside to find the ember of the wood stove nearly gone. He knelt and prodded the coals until they glowed his fingers, remembering the warmth he once took for granted. As the fire filled the cabin with light, Elijah ran a hand through his graying hair and absently fingered the ring he'd never removed, the only promise he'd kept since his wife's death. He thought he'd seen everything. The emptiness of the fields, the betrayal of fellow settlers, the mornings after a blizzard when nothing remained but silhouettes at the horizon. But that evening, as he brushed soot from his coat, he caught sight of movement in the dim light of the back window. A figure emerged, a young woman, slender barely more than a girl, trudging through the knee-deep snow toward the cabin. She wore no shoes, her bare feet pale and red with cold. Her coat, mismatched and torn, was held together in places with strands of string and determination. She paused at the barn door, her body shivering in the wind. Snow clung to the bottom of her coat, and her dark hair plastered itself against her cheek. Her posture, head bowed, shoulders bent, spoke of hunger and exhaustion. Elijah watched transfixed as she raised a trembling hand to knock. His heart clenched oddly. He had never known pity, only the cold logic of survival. But something unnameable stirred in him as he met her, this stranger who had walked himself right into his life. He opened the door without a word, his rifle slung over his arm, and the firelight from inside dancing across his face. When she looked up, her eyes were large and startling steel blue, like meltwater on stone, but quiet and unafraid. No tears, no pleading, only a stillness that held more truth than any cry for help. I saw your notice," she said, her voice raw and soft brittle as frost. "I can work. I don't have any tricks or talismans, just need food shelter." She did not ask to stay, she asked to earn her place. Even through the snow and exhaustion, that defiance made something in Elijah shift. In that moment he recognized a hunger deeper than hers, the ache for connection, a reason to speak again. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly, "before you lose your toes." She slipped inside, the warmth hitting her like a lifeline. Snow dripped from her coat and pooled at her feet. Elijah closed the door, shrugged out his coat, and fetched a blanket from a nail on the wall. She wrapped it around her like a lifeline, gripping the fabric as if safety had a weight she could touch. He didn't ask her name. He didn't offer comfort. In the silent exchange of kindling and the crackle of the fire, something vital changed. In the days that followed, she kept her promise. She lit the fire before dawn, hauling wood from the lean-to. She brushed snow from the porch and fed the horses with a quiet diligence Elijah hadn't seen in years. She rarely spoke, but when she did, it was with intention. She had a skill with hay bales, a knack for packing down snow with careful precision, so it didn't drift back onto pathways. He watched her work, thought of the battles he'd won and lost, and realized he'd not felt like a man in years. He felt like a spectator. One evening, as twilight fell fast over the prairie, Elijah sat at the dinner table across from her for the first time. He ladled stew into their bowls. She looked at him with cautious gratitude in her eyes, fingers touching the bowl before she paused and whispered, "Thank you." It was something he hadn't heard in so long it felt foreign and precious. His throat tightened. At 22, she was young, damaged, resilient. He was old enough to be her uncle. Battle-worn suspicion hardened into muscle memory. But the silence between them grew warmer. She noticed when he used his best blanket and set aside firewood for the stove. He noticed when she paused before talking about her past. He noticed when she worked late by lantern light tracing the barrel staves, carefully sanding out splinters. And when he found her one night in the dim hush of the barn, carefully stitching a tear in his coat with thread from her own scarf, something cracked open. He stepped closer, chest tight. She didn't stop. She was offering piece of herself to him in silence. He watched until he couldn't look away. He walked out silently, and that night he brought her a pair of hand-sewn leather boots. He didn't say where they'd come from or how long he worked them through the night. He just laid them beside her cot and said, "I thought you might need them." She touched the boots with trembling fingers, eyes shining. Then she reached for his hand and pressed it. It was not a question. It was a promise. Montana's snow would keep falling. Winters were harsh, lasting more than half the year. But from that first knock on the barn door, something warmer took root, something neither of them expected. Two people, broken in separate ways, held together by trust, and small kindnesses beginning to build something that might outlast the cold. They would both learn in time that love didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered from the edge of survival when a man opened his door to a stranger beneath the snow. Clara stepped into Elijah's life with the same quiet determination as the prairie snow that blanketed the world outside. Each morning before the sun brushed gold against the frost-white ground, she was already at work, stoking the fire, brushing away winter's residue from the porch, and opening the barn door for the horses. There was a stillness to her moves, graceful and deliberate, as though every action carried its own prayer for peace. Elijah watched her from the cracks in the cabin's doorway. Her dark hair, damp from melting ice, fell over her shoulders as she bent to lift a hay bale. He observed how when she thought no one was looking, she paused, her lips parting in unspoken song, or when she ran her hand over wooden posts, as if memorizing the whisper of grain. He learned her name by accident one chilly evening, when the lantern light caught her features in profile, and he caught himself staring. Without thinking, he said in the quiet room, "You've got the barn door latched wrong." She didn't respond immediately. She finished what she was doing, then slowly turned. "Clara," she offered softly. Her voice was measured, gentle, like someone calling a lost lamb back to shelter. That single word carried more weight than any apology she might have said. Elijah realized then how much he craved sound. He realized how little he had listened in words since his family died. And Clara, quiet. Clara had filled the silence with purpose. He nodded gently, and from that moment on, Clara felt sacred, as if naming her was an act of acknowledgement, not charity. Days grew into weeks. The winter tightened its grip on the land, but the cabin grew warmer, not just from firewood, but from the rhythm of routine. Clara's tasks extended beyond chores. She repaired the cracked panes of Elijah's kitchen window, lining the edges with scraps of cloth to block the drafts. She organized his tools, wiped dust from the old oak table where he ate alone for so long. One afternoon, returning from town, Elijah found her in the barn beneath the lantern's glow. She was bent over his worn coat, her needle inching through frayed fabric thread pulled from her own skirt, colors faded from sun and sorrow. She stitched thread by somber thread, not for thanks, but because it was the right thing to do. Her quiet artistry left him breathless. Without a word, he stood by the barn door, heart raw. She didn't lift her eyes. He cleared his throat and placed a pair of leather boots crafted through the cold night at her feet. For the snow, he said simply, his voice rough with meaning. When she looked up, her eyes glistened in the lantern light like distant stars. She set the boots near her cot, a statement of her presence, her place. They moved closer. One morning, he found unfinished biscuits crusted at the rim of the skillet, a test he suspected of her skill in a kitchen that hadn't seen fresh bread in years. He bit into one half expecting disappointment. Instead, warmth flooded through him. The uneven edges, the pinch of coarseness, they were alive and real. When he set down the biscuit, she leaned forward and asked, her voice so soft he almost missed it. Better? He could only nod. There were moments with Clara that sprung unexpected joy. One late afternoon, he found her in the corral, her laugh drifting up as she taught a young mustang to bow. It was an innocent sound, childish and unguarded, and when he saw her smile, it felt as though chapels of sorrow were crumbling within him. Each day, their interactions deepened. She began bringing him cider warmed with cinnamon. He began bringing her firewood as she set the stove. They exchanged few words, but what passed between them was purposeful and alive. Then came the night he nearly spoke the words no one dared for years. He invited her into the house for supper. Clara paused at the threshold, framed in the warm light. She closed the door and stepped forward like she was crossing into a new life. That night, over coarse stew and worn wooden spoons, Elijah asked the question hanging between them. "What do you want?" "Clara," she set her spoon aside, her eyes searching his. "I want to stay," she said, each word deliberate. "I want to belong." Her voice cracked, and he knew she had never been given permission to feel safe before. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Then stay," he said. The promise was simple, but essential. The world beyond their walls and the storm outside ceased to matter. Their bond was quiet, yes, but powerful. It had the weight of trust earned, of wounds recognized and held sacred. It wasn't about heroics or declarations. It was about the grace in small moments, the courage it took to stay the bravery in admitting one needed another human being. Montana's winter raged on, but inside the cabin they layered trust like logs for a fire that would not go out. The chain of broken hearts around them began to loosen. Clara was found again, not as a stray in the snow, but as a woman named by her rightful owner, neither by law nor force, but by affection and mutual refuge. Elijah often thought back to that first glance in his barn. She had come as a stranger, broken and without baggage. He had given her a chance, and in return, she had given him a reason to rise again. Their story was just beginning, and in those silent dances between chores, shared meals, and unspoken understanding, something precious stirred. The first stage of healing was complete. The deeper journey lay ahead, and it would demand more than boots and stew. It would demand heart, and only time would reveal if they were ready to keep walking forward together. The wind had eased, but the hushed stillness of the cabin felt heavier than any storm. Evening shadows pooled in corners, and the glow of the lantern shook faintly with Clara's unsteady breath. She sat on the cabin's worn bench, her shoulders slumped, as if a heavy burden had pushed her down. Elijah stood behind her, gathering courage from the warmth of the fire that now felt insufficient to hold the truth. He had known there would come a time, an inevitable moment when her past would speak, yet the hush in her voice as she began to speak cut deeper than any blade. "Elijah," she said, the single syllable trembling like a loose thread in winter's last coat. He reached for her hand, silent encouragement, and she exhaled as if the walls themselves had eased their grip. "I wasn't always this quiet," Clara began, then paused. Her gaze dropped to her hands, knuckles white as they clasped together. The room leaned in. Outside, the prairie snow settled as if asking her to continue. "I grew up near Colorado Springs," she continued softly. "Mother told stories of orchards and warm springs. I remember apples, summer days, and the songs of meadowlarks." She paused again, the memories shimmering and receding. "But even then I didn't belong." Elijah waited, every bit of him bracing to understand what lay beneath the silence that had built around her. "When I was 12, she whispered, my father vanished. He went away during a storm to town and never came back. The next day men came. They said I was property worth too little to buy, but too useful to lose. They took me to a ranch near Durango. I thought I would stay there until, well, forever." Her voice cracked. Elijah squeezed her hand but said nothing. "I worked from dawn until dark," she said, eyes glistening. "Cooking, cleaning, writing, whatever they asked. I learned to wake before the sunstoke fires hold my tongue." My mother's name faded like a coin in a fountain. They called me girl or cook, but never Clara. Silence filled the air. Clara's face glowed in the lamp's flicker, pitch-natured beauty etched in shadows. "After 2 years, I escaped." The words fell hard. She blinked back tears but did not look away. "It was a night like this, a whiteout. I stole away on a horse they had left unbranded. I rode blind, following the ridge until my legs gave out." She held her breath. 3 days later, I found a homestead cabin. Warm. Empty. I stayed 10 days, ate bread someone had left, slept by the stove. I thought I was free. Elijah closed his eyes, the fire's sigh marking the moment her truth emerged. "But freedom wasn't a place," she said softly. "It was the fear that someone would come looking for me. So I walked again, west, east, anywhere that didn't carry my story. I hid. I learned to stay unseen." She swallowed. "I learned to forget my name." Elijah traced her jaw gently. "You didn't," he whispered. Clara exhaled slowly. Whispers came, though. A man, the one he called the ranch owner, arrived asking about me. When he came to Montana, he looked for me. She closed her eyes. I thought he'd never leave until I was gone again. So I kept moving. A single tear slid down her cheek. Elijah brushed it away. "You hid in shadows," he said. "You stayed until you had the courage to knock." Clara met his gaze. "Yes." They sat in silence, just the two of them in the wake of a storm, far larger than any prairie blizzard. "You carry more than snow out there," Elijah said quietly. "You carried a past that hunted you." Her head tipped slightly. "It hunted me until yesterday." She tapped the needle holes in his coat. Then I realized I didn't have to run anymore. Elijah released a breath he hadn't known he held. "You're safe here," he said. "With me." Clara nodded, but he sensed the echo of the hurt she carried. So he rose, crossed to the old cupboard, and drew forward a leather satchel. He unbuckled it and removed a small journal, worn leather, faded by years. "I found this behind the stove," he said softly. "I didn't open it. Until tonight." Clara's heart stuttered. That was private. He smiled gently. "It was. But I want you to tell me what's in it when you're ready. No hurry." She closed her eyes, relief mixing with vulnerability. She took the journal, ran fingers over the leather, and tucked it close. "Maybe tomorrow," she whispered. When she left his presence that night, they both carried their burdens lighter. Elijah's heart had grown a little room for hers. Clara, for the first time, tasted the possibility of rest. Outside, the prairie slept under a silver moon. Inside, two souls sat near a fire that dared to hope. In the days that followed, their silence held new meaning. There were no more visits to town, no more furtive glances at trails. The whispers from her past lingered shadows at the edges of a room, but they no longer stifled her. They became part of a story that now had a safe place to settle. And Elijah, once convinced he'd lost all he could lose, found that listening to hard truths, to quiet tears, could be more courageous than any battle he'd ever fought. In his presence, Clara learned that names weren't just words, they were lifelines. And in hers he rediscovered a purpose he thought gone. The cabin grew warmer, not just from wood on the fire, but from two hearts building courage together, one whispered confession at a time. They say peace on the frontier can disappear faster than a prairie sunrise, and for Elijah and Clara that truth thundered toward them one chilly dawn, just as the thaw began stirring in the air. Elijah had stepped outside to feed the horses, his breath visible, his eyes drawn to the horizon's soft glow. He saw a stranger's horse appear on the dirt trail, and felt something tense tighten in his chest, a sensation sharper than the coming day's cold. The man riding toward them was solid, where Elijah was stooped by grief, broad-shouldered, weathered, his long coat caked with mud and dust. He dismounted with practiced ease, horse tossing its head. Elijah recognized him before the man spoke. Jeremiah Pike, a rough claim jumper with a reputation for threats and brutality. Pike clasped his hat in a callous sweep, his gaze sweeping the clearing until it found Clara standing behind Elijah. Elijah Moore. Pike drawled his voice low, cold as a granite quarry. Didn't expect to see you around here, but that girl on your porch, I think she belongs to me. Elijah stopped feeding, stepping between Clara and the man. That sentence claimed her. Pike declared she was property, a possession he'd come to collect. And Clara. She froze, fear clearing from her eyes as shock settled. Elijah's voice came tight. She belongs to no one. Pike laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Not anymore. Funny how things change when a man puts himself in someone's debt. He leaned in, spat onto the ground, and the spittle froze before it spat again. You fool Elijah. I know your reputation, but I've got paper that says this girl is mine. With that, he flicked a crumpled document from his pocket ownership papers, trading Clara like livestock tied to a debt owed by her family. Elijah shut his eyes for a heartbeat before meeting Pike's glare. Patricia Moore might have signed, but Clara never did. His voice remained calm, but beneath it lay a determination grown in years of loss and resilience. Pike stepped forward. Clara trembled behind Elijah, her face pale, but her spine straight. Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder, not to touch, but to anchor them both. "Give it up," Pike sneered. "Otherwise I take her back." He produced a pistol, the dull metal glinting in early daylight. "And if you try something, I won't hesitate." Elijah's heart thundered. He felt the weight of responsibility like an iron yoke. Nothing about this moment was fair, but the fight had begun. He thought of the night spent repairing his cabin, of Clara's hand in his, of her quiet bravery revealed by the fire. He thought of that journal she had begun to fill, filled with nightmares and hope. And he heard his own voice, warm and safe, promising shelter. He wouldn't break that promise. Not now. Elijah Clara whispered, voice trembling but steady. "I need you to let me decide." Elijah hesitated. Pike sneered, gun raised, as if he'd been waiting all day for this. The horses snorted. The wind paused. It was that kind of silence when choices live. Elijah stepped back, his gaze sharp. Clara, go behind the barn. Don't come out until I say." She moved, shoulders shaking but defiant. Pike's eyes followed her. Elijah turned to face him. "We can settle this civil like in town. Court witnesses." Pike spat again, anger flickering. "You really trust that town?" he laughed. "They'll side with me. I've money and skin in this. You're just a broke rancher." Elijah looked onto Pike's rifle barrel in his hand. He thought of Clara's boots by the stove of the trust in her gaze. He thought of all he'd lost. He swallowed. "You'd lay claim to a woman sold twice?" Elijah said softly. Pike didn't answer. He cocked his pistol. That was all Elijah needed. He dove for Clara as Pike fired. The shot went high, splintering fence posts. Dirt exploded. Elijah rolled forward, shouting for Clara to run. She ducked behind the barn. Pike fired again. A bullet chipped wood near her. Dust plumed at her feet. Elijah grabbed the rifle from Pike's hand, a struggle, a twist, Clara screaming. Pike cursed. Elijah wrested the gun. Pike backed off boots, sliding in shifted snow. He saw Elijah's face, steady, resolute, and it stirred something in him. A moment's hesitation, then he lunged. They grappled beneath the horse trough, metal scraping concrete, the rifle flying. Clara, face streaked with tears, ran to Elijah's side. Pike spun. Clara raised the gun Pike had dropped. Her hand shook. Pike froze. Elijah spread his arms. "Don't," he whispered. "She doesn't want—" Pike lunged again as Clara fired. The shot echoed, struck Pike's shoulder. He stumbled, horror widening his eyes. Clara dropped the pistol chest, heaving. Pike collapsed to a knee. Elijah stood slowly, offering a hand. Pike spat and cursed, but didn't move. Clara collapsed against Elijah, trembling. He enveloped her in his arms. The dawn broke over them, light on snow on hearts cracked open. Seconds felt like years before Clara looked up. Pike lay at their feet, silent. Elijah found Pike's pistol and laid it in the snow face down. He stepped toward Pike, who glared, defeated. Elijah knelt. "Leave," he said quietly. "Take your papers, take your claims, but don't come back." Pike spat one last time, wrenched himself upright, and stumbled away. Clara squeezed Elijah's hand. They watched him ride off before Clara leaned into him. They didn't speak much as they walked back. She touched the bullet hole in the fence, pointed out a splinter. Elijah took her hand and led her inside. The barn door closed, and the gunfire echo died away. Inside the cabin, Claire shook as Elijah fetched whiskey. He poured 2 small cups. Clara held hers, staring into the amber liquid. Elijah touched her shoulder. She swallowed, pushed the cup to him. They drank together. The warmth spread not from the whiskey, but from knowing the fight was over. For now. Soon word spread through town. Men came offering help or sympathy or scorn. Elijah welcomed whoever was willing to work the land. Clara continued her chores, head held high. The gunfight was quiet proof of belonging, a declaration without grand words. That evening they sat by the fire. Clara opened her journal. She wrote, fingers silent in moonlight. Elijah read over her shoulder, eyes moist. She looked up. "Thank you," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. She leaned in and kissed his cheek. The fire crackled. The moment didn't need words. Trouble came riding. Yes, but love stayed standing. In the frontier's quiet aftermath, Elijah and Clara discovered that sometimes home isn't built on land or license. It's forged in courage, sacrifice, and the decision to stand together when the world demands you run. Elijah Moore never forgot the sound. That soft knock on his cabin door. It came just past midnight after days of snow, and silence had sealed the ranch in a kind of grief no shovel could clear. He had been staring into the fire again alone, listening to it crackle against the growing chill. His mind wandered, as it often did now, to Clara's laughter, the way her eyes danced when she managed to saddle the gelding alone, how she filled the corners of his home with something he hadn't known he was missing until she left. She'd been gone for weeks by then, left with a pack slung over her shoulder and tears in her eyes, saying she couldn't be the reason he lost everything. Said the world didn't take kindly to a woman with no papers, no family, no clean past. Said she loved him too much to let him lose the last thing he still owned: his land, his name, his dignity. He'd watched her walk into the snow and never begged her to stay. That was his mistake. Now days blurred into one another. The cows still needed hay. The fence still sagged by the creek. But Elijah moved like a shadow among chores, boots, heavy shoulders low. The house no longer smelled of fresh bread or pine soap. It echoed not with sound, but with the absence of sound. That's what made the knock so jarring. He thought at first it was wind, but it came again. 3 soft raps, tentative, then still. Elijah stood slowly, his knees cracking, heart stumbling in his chest. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in like a flood, and there she was. Clara. Her coat was threadbare, clinging to her like old skin. Her hands, raw and red, were clenched around a cloth bundle. Snow clung to her hair, her lashes. She looked up, eyes filled not with fear but apology. She didn't speak at first, and neither did he. They just stared, the fire behind him, glowing against the darkness at her back. "I tried," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I found work down south. A kitchen, 3 meals, 4 walls. It was safe. But I kept looking at the door every night, wondering if it would open the way yours did." Elijah said nothing. He stepped back, leaving the door open. She stepped through her body, shaking with the cold, but not with fear. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her like a long-lost friend. She sank into the old chair by the fire. Elijah brought a blanket, draped it over her shoulders. She held it close and wept, not loudly, but the kind of crying that came from exhaustion, from carrying too much for too long. "I didn't know if you'd still be here," she whispered. "I didn't know if I'd still be me," Elijah replied, and that broke the last wall between them. He made her tea, the old kind with cinnamon bark she used to love. They didn't talk much that night. Instead, Clara sat wrapped in warmth, watching the fire, watching him, and Elijah. He sat across from her, thankful he hadn't blown out the lamp, thankful that she had remembered the way home. Morning came gray and silent. The snow had stopped and the sun tried its best to pierce the clouds. Clara had fallen asleep on the chair, her face soft, peaceful. Elijah watched her breathe, remembering the nights she had done the same for him. When she finally stirred, he was already in the kitchen slicing bread, boiling eggs. "I can help," she said groggily. "You already have," he replied without turning. The days that followed didn't promise forgiveness or erasure. Life didn't work like that. But something settled in the way they moved around each other, as if the parting had carved out a deeper understanding of how fragile and precious connection really was. Elijah fixed the saddle she'd left behind. Clara patched the curtains that had torn in the wind. She didn't ask to stay. He didn't ask where she'd been. It was as if the questions were less important than the quiet answer found in presence itself. But the world outside hadn't forgotten. Whispers in town started again. The girl had returned. That woman with no name, no right. They saw her in town once, buying flour. Saw her wrap her shawl tighter, walk faster. One man tipped his hat and muttered, "Doesn't belong." Elijah heard it all, and he had had enough. The next morning, he rode into the county clerk's office. Clara rode behind him. They didn't wear Sunday best, just coats and boots and the truth of who they were. Elijah laid a weathered hand on the desk and said plainly, "We're here to be married." The clerk blinked, looked at Clara, then at Elijah. Full name, Elijah looked at her and she nodded. "Clara Moore," he said. That was all. Papers were signed, a seal pressed. No rings, no vows shouted. Just a quiet agreement that this what they had was real. And nothing could take it now. That night, Clara cooked supper. Elijah set the table. They ate in silence, but it was the warm kind, the kind where you don't have to talk to be understood. Before bed, he lit the fire in her room, laid out the quilt she had stitched herself. She smiled. "I kept hoping I could come back," she said. "You never really left," he answered. And in the middle of that Wyoming winter, as coyotes cried in the hills and stars blinked cold and clear above the roof, the wind changed its tune. It no longer howled like something grieving. It hummed like something returning home. And Elijah knew deep down in the bones he'd broken building this ranch that some things some people are worth waiting for. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many doors they have to knock. The story of Elijah and Clara began on a bitter winter's night when a silent knock cracked open the door to a frozen world, and it ended with a promise that would melt the hardest hearts. Through snowstorms of pain, silence, fear, and hope, they rebuilt a life from broken pieces, teaching us what it means to choose connection over survival, love over loneliness, trust over doubt. At the outset, Elijah Moore was a man shaped by grief, solitude, and stubborn resignation. The loss of his wife and son had driven him into isolation, where he mended fences and fed cattle more than he nurtured his own soul. When he posted that unassuming help wanted sign, he thought he was merely seeking labor. He had no idea he'd find something far more vital, a purpose reborn, in caring for another human being. Clara, nameless and wounded, had lost herself in a harsh world that viewed her as property. Sold, abused, discarded. Burned out by disappointment, she arrived barefoot on his porch, carrying only her defiance and scars. In the face of Elijah's offer, neither pity nor promise, she began to stitch her life together first, by repairing his coat, then by shaping a space where she could feel deserving of peace. Their bond deepened in quiet rhythms, morning chores, shared meals, stolen glances by lantern light. Elijah offered her shoes, shelter, a name. Clara offered him presence, earnest work, tentative trust. Neither expected grand declarations, but each small gesture, a fixed saddle, a bowl of stew, a shared laugh grew into a foundation of something profound, mutual respect, slowly woven into love. The turning point came when trouble rode in, as a man named Jeremiah Pike arrived with ownership papers and a gun. He claimed Clara by old debts and cruel law, expecting their quiet life to crumble. But Elijah's courage, fueled by love and integrity, protected Clara, and proved belonging is won by commitment and solidarity, not by printed title. Clara's shot that ended Pike's claim symbolized the collapse of forced ownership and the birth of real agency, hers and theirs together. Then came loss again, only different. Clara left Elijah rather than be the reason for his ruin, stirring in him the same ache he'd thought buried. His silence afterward spoke louder than words. For weeks, life without her went on, but felt lifeless. Fields withered. Chores were done out of habit, not will. The cabin stood empty. The fire burned low. Then that knock again, soft, resolute, and Clara returned home. In that act lay the real miracle: two broken people, brave enough to leave, wiser enough to return. Their marriage, quiet and unassuming, marked a new chapter that didn't erase their pasts but transformed them. They faced whispers, social prejudice, legal watchfulness, but inside the small cabin and on the prairie beyond their union became a beacon. Two people chosen of their own free will, naming each other, witnessed only by those willing to see beyond surfaces and claims. What can we learn from their journey? First, true healing comes through small acts of care. Elijah didn't save a damsel in distress. He offered a coat a place by the fire shelter from the storm. Gentle acts that said, "You matter." Clara didn't dramatize her rescue. She returned those offers with diligence, trust, and loyalty. In our lives, love doesn't always arrive in sweeping gestures. It often begins with coffee made for someone else, a hand laid on a shoulder, a presence when words fail. Second courage is choosing to stand for what's right when it matters most. Elijah could have backed down when Pike confronted them. Instead, he refused to let someone claim Clara like livestock. And Clara, faced with fear, stood beside Elijah. That moment wasn't just about brandished pistols, it was about affirming dignity. In our world, we may not face literal gunfights, but we will face moments demanding we choose integrity over convenience, justice over silence, safety for others over self-preservation. Third, true belonging is earned and chosen, not forced. Clara's decision to return was not a submission, it was a choice, and Elijah choosing to marry her legally and lovingly was his. Their union wasn't ordained by bloodlines or property, it was built on trust action and mutual recognition. Sometimes society tells us where we fit or not, but belonging is reclaimed when we step into spaces, speak truths, plant roots, and make choices that affirm our own worth. Lastly, it's never too late to rewrite your story. Elijah had surrendered to grief. Clara had surrendered to survival. Yet both found redemption in choosing to try again. The fields healed, the barn warmed. A life built on loss morphed into a livelihood filled with possibility. Their story reminds us that no matter how long winter lasts, thaw can come. No matter how broken we are, restoration is possible.